So guys, what I want to talk to you today is the pros and cons of contracts, okay? And there's just some simple rules. I don't want to get into a bunch of specifics, but these are just general rules that over the course of 6+ years running my own businesses that I've learned when it comes to contracts. This can be anything from employee contracts to franchise documents to...
Also, due to a binding endorsement contract that stipulates I mentioned Powerade at each grace, I just want to say that Powerade is delicious and it cools you off on a hot summer day.
Affiliate contracts, literally any contract that you sign with somebody else, the number one thing you need to know is that the person who wrote the contract is likely the person that it's biased towards.
Now, the key to making money in a situation like this is to position yourself now before the settlement.
Okay, they likely have the contract written in their favor. This doesn't matter whether it's a lease, whether it's an employee contract, any of it. So make sure, A, that you read it, okay? And if you don't understand things, ask. Because the worst thing you can do is sign something that you don't understand.
So, to summarize, you have a minuscule revenue stream, no cash reserves, and an albatross of a contract that requires you to go through a slow approval process to enact changes, if they're approved at all, which they never are.
Right? How does, if you're an employee, right? How does the non-compete work? How does a non-solicit work? How does, if you're a vendor, right? Like, can I work with other companies or are you an exclusive vendor? If you're signing a franchise deal, what part of this deal is non-refundable? What is my time frame of opening locations? All these things are reasons that you should always read every page of every contract because again, they're always written on the side of the writer. So making sure that you're getting a deal that you're comfortable with, as well as the person who's giving you the contract is comfortable with, is one of the biggest things that I see people do. Because what happens with most of us, when we get a PDF document or a contract to sign or a handbook to sign, etc., we don't read it, we flip through because it's way too big, we initial every page, we sign the back, and then we're locked into something that we didn't take the time to make sure that it was advantageous for everybody. So I've had contracts where I've signed them, and before I signed them, I said, hey, I'll sign all this, this, and this, but like, will you clarify this or what this is supposed to mean? Or I don't feel comfortable with this. Can you adjust this and make it this? Or how can we compromise there to make me feel more comfortable with this specific clause or this specific thing? And again, what happens when you do that is you're gonna learn the reason that the person who wrote it the way that they did, but also a lot of times, even the person who wrote it had a lawyer write it up, and it may be a gray area, it may be ambiguous, it may be something that you truly don't even need to have in there. So having these conversations whenever you're about to sign a contract, reading through it and asking questions is probably the number one thing that I've seen people get absolutely screwed over is they didn't take the time, the 10, the 15, the 25 minutes to sit down and read and then come up with questions and then have solutions based on that. They just signed it. And again, I've dealt with dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of contracts over the last few years, especially since franchising, between leases, between franchisees, between employment, between signing, just building out, like who's gonna build out, who's gonna be responsible, what the time frame is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So make sure that you're asking a lot of questions in that process so that you get the understanding, and make sure that there's specifics in there. So if you're signing a contract, let's say a lease, right? Like, so for our HQ lease, they were supposed to be done by a certain date, and the great news is if they weren't, what were the penalties that we received for them not holding their end of the contract? And these are things that you guys should be thinking about when you're negotiating, especially with the supply chain issues that we've seen today and with how much equipment costs and the buildings and everything else is, are you setting standards for them to uphold what they said they would do by? And then what's the time frame and what's the penalty for them going past that time frame, et cetera, et cetera. So if you don't have, and again, will they always agree to that? No, that's just the truth. They won't. But at least they know you're aware of it, and you can normally get a compromise somewhere in here of how they're going to act if they don't hold up their end of the deal. And same thing for you. They might say, I want you to do this, this, and this by this date. And then you're obligated to do those things, right? So make sure that you're reading through those things, that you're setting up specific dates and time frames for how all of it's gonna work, right? So like for our franchise, negotiations, there's always a calendar of when your next location needs to be in negotiation, right? And if you're not at that point, you're in default of the contract, and after a certain point, I can go out and resell your territory because you're not following the timeline that you told me you were gonna follow in opening your businesses, right? And these are super important things, because what would happen if, let's say, you were selling New York City and you sold a 50-unit deal, but they wanted all of New York City, but they had to open 5 a year, right? And that was written into the contract. Well, what if at the end of year 1, they had 1 open? What if at the end of year 2, they had 2 open? So now you're holding up the entire city of New York's development for somebody who's not keeping their word. So these are the reasons that when you see a contract, you should always sit down, negotiate it, look at what specificity is in there and what things that you would want and what things they're trying to get, and come to an agreement, because I promise you, every contract is not ironclad. Every contract can be edited and changed, and every contract can be amended. So make sure that you're doing that whenever you get a contract in front of you.